Um, there is the old technology type of formative assessment and the new technology type. And I talk about both because we have many teachers that aren't terribly comfortable with using technology. More and more, I'm going with my tablet and doing things that are easy for me to capture in the classroom. So the first one I'm going to show you is my old way. So this is an old paper and pencil kind of formative assessment that I use with children as they are doing oral reading. And this is a comprehension check based on narrative story grammars. And so either with an individual or with a small group or a whole class, I would use this to get a 10-point score about how well students were able to construct meaning from what they've read. And the little image of this is we're sitting in a small group with my alligator group, and we finish reading the story, and I say, okay, so what happened? Tell me about this story. And then I'm hoping that my students will give me a pretty complete retelling with the beginning, the middle, the end, and the statement of the problem and something about the characters. So this retelling analysis, then I can just mark what they've done and easily. It's just putting in a tally mark. Um, and over time, then I can measure how my different groups of readers are progressing with their ability to construct comprehension as they read. This particular analysis, and this is from Leslie Morrow's book on comprehension, is something that I have used very successfully, even with whole group instruction. When I ask my high school class of history students, what'd you just read about? And they start telling me, I can use this to kind of keep track of how well the group can tell me has happened in the reading, as long as history is a good example because much of historical reading is in a narrative structure. So in this case, I can keep track of how my different classes are coming along. I can plot this on a graph, show growth over time. I do that in our literacy lab as we're trying to help our teachers learn how to collect data for response to intervention meetings. This is a really great tool for doing that for students with comprehension challenges. So that is one. What I do need to say about this is, obviously, this is for narratives. To do this for informational text, for your science textbook, or for an essay about states' rights or anything like that, you would need to adjust the data points that you're tracking. And now I've gone to graphic organizers where I'll put down the main ideas and details and still try to keep it to about 10 data points, because in my little mind, that's about how many I can keep track of at any particular time. Okay, so I want to switch over then to a different paper and pencil that I used in my classroom when I was having students do silent sustained reading. And my students would start their day and this is at the high school level, as soon as the bell rang, they started with 5 to 10 minutes of silent reading from materials that they wanted to read, their own self-selected materials. And I actually used this as a grade, although you can see there's no actual evaluation of their comprehension or their words correct per minute or anything like that. This was my point in this activity, was to help them develop agency as readers and to learn to enjoy reading as they left school. I mean, these were mostly juniors that I was working with at this point. And I wanted them to develop habits of selecting materials and reading them. And so they were allowed to bring in anything they wanted. I also had a classroom library, and if they came in and were ready, came in early, found materials on my reading cart, or brought their own materials and began as soon as the bell rang, they'd get a mark in this first column. And I would organize them by the seating chart so that all I have to do is go down the row and mark who started. And then I would watch them. And for years, a lot of the silent sustained reading programs said that the teacher should read with the students. And I always started with them so that they knew that I was engaged, but my students knew I was a reader. So then I started watching them. And I would look to see that their eyes were going across the page rather than just flipping through magazines looking at the pictures. I also gave them credit for bringing their own materials, and although they were always welcome to use the materials I had in the classroom, I think it shows greater agency, greater engagement if they bring their own materials. One of the rules was you can't read assignments for other classes. And then the last one was whether students would stay on task. And I'd take maybe 5 of those during a day. So I'd keep track of this for a week. And at the end of the week, I would give them a letter grade to go into their grade that reflected their engagement in the silent sustained reading. So there's a little anecdote that goes with this. The high school that I was working at when I did this, I had a vice president or a vice principal who had been in the Marines, and he very much loved Marine discipline and that kind of organizational structure. And when I first started working there, he was really disturbed that I let my students sit on the floor, read under the table, and so I had to explain to him about why I was doing that. And one day he came downstairs and I was up at the desk and the bell had rung, and I could tell he was unhappy with me for being up there. So he goes down to my room, and every single one of my students, and these were challenging students. I had kids assigned to me because they were problems in their regular English class. Every single one of them was sitting there reading silently. And he came back out and he asked me, "What did you do?" And I said, "They just get credit for doing the reading." And I said, one of the things that they have to do is if I'm hung up on a phone call or I'm consulting with another teacher, whenever I walk in the room, they need to be reading, and they just automatically start. They start as soon as the bell rings. So he started bringing people down to show them how my class, I didn't ever have to tell them time to get work. I didn't have to clap hands or flashlights or anything. As soon as the bell went off, my students were reading, most of them really happily, and stuff that they cared about. So this is an example of another way that you can capture data. And I would be able to say, okay, so Oma is having trouble finding something that she wants to read. So I need to have a conversation with her about how she can find something a little bit more engaging than 17 magazine, whatever. Okay, so another example of the paper and pencil format is one that I used for group work. Okay, so in this spreadsheet, I'm working, it's the formative assessment that I was using when I had students working in small discussion groups. And they all always had a role initially. So one would be the recorder, one would be the discussion leader, one would be a questioner, one would be a clarifier, and one would be a researcher. And so I would just mark which of those 5 roles they were filling. I always really emphasize to my students asking good questions in discussion group. And we talked about open-ended questions, about fact questions, about real questions, things that you wonder about as opposed to things that you're just checking for somebody else's understanding. I look to see that they had really read or thought about whatever they were asked to do to prepare for the discussion group. I would mark whether they had notes and resources with them. I really put a lot of emphasis on listening courteously to other people and hearing them rather than trying to predict what you're going to say next. They could get points for extending the conversation so that this is similar to asking good questions, but it is a little bit more about adding new information, taking the conversation further or broadening it or drilling down. Of course, I always had us staying on task so that I would um, they weren't talking between other groups and they weren't running out to their lockers or whatever. And then on this one, I would leave space for comments so that if something interesting was going on in the group or I saw somebody having trouble, I could make little notes for myself about what was going on. Initially, this comment place I could use for keeping track of information or evidence that maybe they weren't participating as well as they should. So I might put down, you really didn't get a very good performance evaluation here because you guys were talking about the new wheels on Fred's car. And it completely stop the whining and complaining about not getting a good grade. And I typically never ever had to talk about that again. That they knew that I was sitting there really paying attention to all of them. And so as they were working in their small groups, I would circulate around the class with my clipboard and keep making little notes. And of course, that leaves me free to also talk with the groups. I didn't have to stand there and identify them all the time. But it was a good little way for me to put the emphasis on what I really wanted them to develop within the class. And of course, with Common Core now, this ability to listen and work in groups and work productively is really valued and emphasized. And also with the 21st century skills, all of this becomes really important behavior both as citizens and as employees. And so there's not much that I would change about this at this point. Now let's go over to new technologies. And in this case, there are some really interesting. So new technologies really allow me to capture this data easily, and there are a number of ways that I go about this. One of the ways that now I work with college students, but I've seen high school and junior high and elementary students do this, are the kind of student response systems that you see being promoted. This particular um, platform is Nearpod, and I like Nearpod because of its diagnostics, the reports that it sends back to me, and the ability to show the response live as we go. But there are many other tools similar to this, including just a Google Forms poll or Google poll. This was an example of a Nearpod in-class formative assessment that I did with students to help them learn a pretty complicated diagnostic procedure called miscue analysis. And so I had in this first part of the presentation, seeing 2 slides I had, and you can't see it well here, but it's actually a line of text with miscue markings of the oral reading errors or miscues of an elementary student. And I wanted them to focus on her substitution of the word pretending for peered. And so my second slide is actually what they would call a quiz, but I'm just going to call a formative assessment point. And so it's like, this question is, to what extent did the reader use graphophonics cues when she substituted pretending for peered? And they chose high part or low. They send it in to me. I can watch that everybody's data's come in, and then I can project the little pie graph of how many got it right, how many didn't get it right, and how many forgot to answer. And then we have this great discussion about, well, all of you got this right, so you understand it. Or a lot of you thought it was only partial. Let's do some counting of the match between the phonemes and the graphemes. And so I use it as a teacher to get a sense of how well my students are understanding this kind of difficult diagnostic tool, but also as a way to engage discussion in the classroom so that I'm really getting a good sense of how well they're learning the concepts and what I need to go back and reteach. My students love this. They would have me do this every session because they love the immediacy of the feedback. They love seeing the class improve, and they become very collaborative about that. That, we want to work on this part so that we could get, a big pie section. Um, I've used similar platforms to do pre-assessments of student background knowledge about topics. So I'll just have statements about whether they agree or disagree, anticipation reaction guide, and I they mark whether they agree with the statement or disagree, and I can display the graphic to the class, how many agreed, how many disagreed, and we can have this great discussion about it. But then it also gives me information about what my students already know. And that's another teaching strategy, pedagogical approach that you can use with old technology or with new technology. And why it's really important, and this is a great example of why we want every teacher to be using formative assessment. I was showing this to some middle school teachers because they wanted to improve student performance, and they were beginning to do a study of westward expansion, and particularly the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so I put together an anticipation guide for them, and the students marked their statements, and then we had this class discussion. And it turned out that the students already knew everything the teachers were going to teach. And so it freed us up for 2 weeks to do some things in the classroom that the teachers wouldn't otherwise have done with this group of students. But by a simple 10-minute activity on what do you already know about the Lewis and Clark expedition and the westward expansion, they were able to grab a whole bunch of instructional time that was of great value.